There's a kind of magic that exists in the first days of summer, moment when the air itself seems to hum with possibility. On Sycamore Street, summer arrived not with the flip of a calendar page, but with the sound of screen doors slamming, the smell of fresh-cut grass, and the sight of kids spilling into the streets like marbles poured from a jar. It was as though the whole world had been holding its breath, waiting for school to end, and now it had exhaled in a rush of sunlight and cicada song. Sycamore Street was my whole world then, a stretch of cracked pavement lined with tidy, modest houses, each one framed by a square patch of lawn and a single tree that reached for the sky like a promise. Our sycamores were ancient and generous, their branches wide and sprawling, casting dappled shadows that danced across the sidewalk. They gave our street its name, but more than that, they gave it a sense of permanence, as though they had always been there and always would be, no matter how much the world changed. That summer began like so many others, with a bike ride down the street that felt as natural as breathing. My bike was a battered old thing, its red paint chipped and its tires scuffed, but it was my freedom, my ticket to anywhere. The air was warm and sweet, carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle from the bushes that lined the Hendersons' yard. I pedaled lazily, savoring the feel of the wind against my face, the sound of my tires humming against the pavement. Jimmy O'Connor was the first to join me, his own bike wobbling slightly as he veered into the street with a grin. Jimmy was the kind of kid who never walked when he could run, never spoke when he could shout. His energy was boundless, infectious, and it pulled you along whether you wanted to go or not. He was the heart of our little gang, the spark that set every adventure in motion. We were halfway to the end of the street when Toad came barreling out of his driveway, his shoelaces flapping wildly as he struggled to keep up. Toad wasn't his real name, of course, it was Thomas Franklin, but the nickname had stuck years ago, for reasons no one could quite remember. He was small and scrappy, with a tendency to trip over his own feet, but he had a heart as big as the sycamores themselves. By the time we reached the old lot where the street curved toward the woods, Susie was waiting for us, leaning against her bike with an air of practiced indifference. Susie Harper wasn't like the other girls in the neighborhood, she didn't care about dolls or frilly dresses, and she could ride faster, throw farther, and climb higher than any of us. She was sharp and fearless, and though none of us would have admitted it then, she was the glue that held us together. Together, the four of us made up the ruling council of Sycamore Street, self-appointed and universally acknowledged. We didn't need plans or schedules, our days unfolded naturally, guided by the whims of the moment. That first day, the moment led us to the sycamore tree at the corner, the largest and oldest of them all, its trunk thick and gnarled, its branches stretching wide enough to shade half the block. It was our meeting place, our headquarters, the center of our universe. We sprawled beneath its branches, the grass cool against our skin, and let the day stretch out before us like an endless horizon. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shifting as we tossed ideas back and forth, each one bigger and wilder than the last. A fort in the woods, a treasure map drawn in chalk, a game of tag that would stretch across the entire neighborhood, anything was possible. As the morning faded into afternoon, the heat pressed down on us, thick and heavy, until we abandoned the tree in search of cooler ground. The creek wasn't far, a winding ribbon of water that twisted through the woods behind the neighborhood. Its banks were lined with smooth stones and tangled roots, its surface dotted with tiny ripples where minnows darted just below. It was the perfect place to skip rocks, catch frogs, or simply sit with your feet in the water, letting the coolness soak into your skin. We spent hours there, the world shrinking down to the sound of water and the occasional splash of a rock breaking the surface. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, a scent so vivid it seemed to anchor itself in my memory, tied forever to that summer and that place. Time felt different by the creek, slower and richer, each moment stretching like the lazy arc of a stone skipping across the water. When the sun dipped low, casting the woods in golden light, we made our way back to Sycamore Street, our pockets full of smooth stones and our hair tangled with leaves. The air had cooled slightly, the heat of the day giving way to the soft promise of evening. We parked our bikes beneath the sycamore tree and sprawled on the grass once more, our laughter echoing in the stillness. As the streetlights flickered on, one by one, the world seemed to hold its breath again. Fireflies emerged from the shadows, their tiny lights blinking like stars scattered across the lawns. We chased them with reckless abandon, our hands outstretched, our laughter mingling with the hum of the crickets. It was a simple joy, fleeting and perfect, a moment that would linger in my mind long after the fireflies were gone. That night, as I lay in bed with the scent of summer still clinging to my skin, I felt the peculiar satisfaction that comes from a day well spent. Outside, the fireflies still danced, their lights fading and reappearing like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The summer had only just begun, and it stretched ahead of us like an open road, full of wonder and promise. The next morning dawned with the kind of light that only summer mornings seem to hold, soft and golden, spilling over the rooftops of Sycamore Street like honey. The air was already warm, promising another hot day, and the world outside my window buzzed with life. Birds chattered noisily in the trees, and somewhere down the block, a sprinkler ticked methodically, sending arcs of water glittering through the air. When I stepped outside, Jimmy was already waiting under the sycamore tree, his bike leaning lazily against the trunk. He held a box of colored chalk in his hands, the kind that left your fingers dusted with vibrant powder after just one stroke. He had a look in his eye that I recognized immediately, a look that meant he'd thought of something grand, something that would consume our day and possibly the days to come. By the time Toad and Susie arrived, Jimmy's plan was already taking shape. The wide stretch of pavement in front of the Hendersons' yard was the perfect canvas, its surface warm beneath the sun and bordered by shady trees that would offer some relief from the heat. We each grabbed a piece of chalk, Toad chose a bright green, Susie a deep purple, and I a pale blue, and we set to work. At first, the drawings were simple, lines and shapes scattered across the asphalt, hesitant and uncertain, as though testing the limits of what was possible. But soon, our imaginations took over, and the street transformed before our eyes. Jimmy sketched the walls of a towering castle, its turrets spiraling upward, complete with a drawbridge and a moat that flowed across the gutter. Susie added a village at its base, tiny houses nestled close together, their roofs peaked and neat. Toad, true to form, created a dense forest on the castle's edge, its trees jagged and wild, their roots reaching like claws. I drew the dragon. Its body coiled and stretched across the pavement, its scales shimmering in shades of blue and green, its wings spread wide as though ready to take flight. Its eyes were fierce, its tail long and curved, and its claws dug deep into the earth. It wasn't perfect, the wings were lopsided, and one of the legs looked more like a tree stump, but it was ours, part of the world we were building together. The chalk dust clung to our hands and knees, and our faces were streaked with smudges of color as the sun climbed higher overhead. Mrs. Henderson poked her head out the window to see what we were up to, her smile softening the sternness of her usual expression. A few younger kids from down the block wandered over, their curiosity drawing them in like moths to a flame. We let them add their own touches, a row of flowers here, a patch of stars there, until the street was alive with color and life. By midday, the kingdom stretched from one side of the street to the other, a sprawling masterpiece that seemed to vibrate with energy. The moat sparkled with hints of silver where someone had added tiny fish, and the forest was dotted with strange creatures that Toad insisted were friendly, though their sharp teeth and glowing eyes suggested otherwise. The castle walls were strong and unyielding, their lines bold and sure, and the dragon loomed over it all, its wings casting shadows across the tiny village below. But a kingdom is not meant to be admired from afar, it is meant to be lived in, its walls echoing with the sounds of adventure and triumph. Jimmy declared himself king, fashioning a crown from a scrap of newspaper he'd found in the gutter. Susie became the royal architect, her responsibility to expand the village and keep the king's imagination in check. Toad was a knight, armed with a stick he'd found beneath the sycamore tree, and I, of course, was the dragon, ready to swoop down from my chalk-drawn perch and wreak havoc on the unsuspecting realm. The game began slowly, the way all great games do, our roles uncertain and our rules flexible. But soon, the kingdom came alive, our laughter echoing across the street as we darted between the chalk-drawn walls and leaped over imaginary rivers. The dragon roared and chased the night, its wings sweeping through the air as its claws raked the ground. The king shouted orders from his throne, his crown askew, and the architect built taller and taller towers, her chalk-streaked hands a blur of movement. We played until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the pavement. The kingdom's colors deepened in the golden light, its outlines softened by the fading heat. The air was cooler now, and the street was quiet, save for the sound of crickets beginning their nightly song. We sat together on the curb, our hands and clothes stained with chalk dust, our faces flushed with the joy of a day well spent. The streetlights flickered on one by one, their warm glow illuminating the kingdom's borders. The younger kids had gone home, their laughter now a distant memory, and the world felt smaller, quieter, as though it were wrapping itself around us like a blanket. The dragon's eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light, and the castle walls stood tall, their lines steady and true. That night, as I lay in bed with the scent of summer still clinging to my skin, I thought about the kingdom we had created. It was fragile, its colors fleeting, its walls destined to fade with the morning dew or the next rain. But for that one day, it had been real as the sycamore tree or the creek or the stars that blinked faintly outside my window. It was a reminder that even the simplest things, chalk, a stretch of pavement, the boundless imagination of a child, could hold the power to transform the world. If Sycamore Street was the heart of our world, the creek was its wild and untamed soul. It wound its way through the woods just beyond the neighborhood, a narrow ribbon of water shaded by ancient trees whose roots tangled along its banks like the fingers of giants reaching into the earth. The creek had been our sanctuary for as long as I could remember, a place where time slowed down, and the rules of the world didn't seem to apply. We didn't have a plan that morning, we rarely did. The sun was already high, its warmth soaking into the pavement as we gathered beneath the sycamore tree, our legs dangling lazily over our bikes. The dragon from the day before still loomed faintly on the asphalt, its lines softened and smudged by the passage of time. It seemed to watch us as we set off toward the woods, our tires humming against the pavement, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. The trail to the creek was a familiar one, marked by the rusted remains of an old gate that had long since fallen into disrepair. The path beyond was uneven, its dirt packed hard by years of footsteps and the occasional rainfall. The trees closed in around us as we walked, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, golden glow. The air grew cooler the deeper we went, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp leaves and moss. The creek greeted us with its usual quiet murmur, its surface dappled with sunlight that danced like liquid gold. The water was clear, its shallow bed lined with smooth stones that glinted faintly beneath the ripples. Minnows darted here and there, their tiny bodies catching the light as they moved in quick, synchronized bursts. The sound of the water was steady and soothing, a constant rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the woods. We spread out along the banks, each of us drawn to our own corner of the creek. Jimmy claimed a flat rock that jutted out over the water, its surface warm from the sun. He sat there with a stick in his hands, poking at the current as though trying to chart its course. Toad waded knee-deep into the creek, his shoes abandoned on the bank as he bent down to scoop up handfuls of stones, inspecting each one with the intensity of a jeweler examining a rare gem. Susie perched on a fallen log, her stick tracing idle patterns in the mud as she watched the minnows dart around her feet. I walked upstream, following the creek as it curved gently through the woods. The sound of the water grew louder as I went, mingling with the rustling of leaves and the occasional trill of a bird. The farther I went, the more the woods seemed to change. The trees here were older, their trunks thicker and their roots more gnarled. The air was cooler, heavier, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. I stopped when I saw it, a glint of something unusual among the stones at the edge of the water. It was small and faint, a flash of light that caught my eye just as I was about to turn back. I crouched down, my fingers brushing against the cool surface of the stones as I searched for the source of the glint. It didn't take long to find it, a tiny object, no bigger than a marble, half buried in the mud. It was a stone, but unlike any stone I'd seen before. Its surface was smooth and polished, its color a deep, shimmering blue that seemed to shift and change as I turned it in my hand. It felt warm to the touch, its weight solid and comforting, as though it had been waiting for me to find it. The light that had caught my eye seemed to emanate from within the stone itself, a faint, steady glow that was almost imperceptible in the daylight. The discovery filled me with a sense of wonder, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. It was as though the stone held a secret, something ancient and profound, something that connected me to the creek and the woods and the world beyond. I slipped it into my pocket, its weight a quiet reassurance as I made my way back downstream. When I returned to the group, the others were still lost in their own pursuits, their voices mingling with the sound of the water. Jimmy was building a dam with a handful of sticks and stones, his face flushed with the effort of arranging each piece just so. Toad had created a small tower of rocks, its precarious height a testament to his persistence. Susie had ventured farther into the creek, her feet splashing lightly as she reached for a fallen branch caught in the current. I didn't tell them about the stone, not then. It wasn't that I wanted to keep it a secret, but something about it felt personal, as though it were meant for me alone. Instead, I joined Jimmy at the dam, adding my own stones to his creation, feeling the cool water rush over my hands as I worked. The creek carried on around us, its current strong and steady, as though it didn't mind our presence, as though it welcomed us into its quiet, ancient rhythm. We stayed until the sun dipped low, the shadows stretching long across the water. The air grew cooler, and the light softened, casting the woods in a golden haze. When we finally made our way back to Sycamore Street, our clothes damp and our hands streaked with mud, the world felt quieter, gentler, as though the creek's calm had followed us home. That night, as I lay in bed with the stone resting on my nightstand, its faint glow visible even in the dark, I thought about the creek and the woods and the strange feeling that had settled over me when I found it. The summer stretched ahead like a story waiting to be told, and I couldn't help but wonder what else it had in store. The first sign that the summer fair was coming to town was the appearance of the posters. They were tacked to telephone poles, taped to shop windows, and pinned to the bulletin board outside the general store. Bright and colorful, they promised a weekend of thrills and wonders, the Ferris wheel towering over Miller's Field, the carousel's painted horses glinting in the sun, games of chance and skill where prizes dangled tantalizingly out of reach. To us kids, those posters were as good as an invitation to adventure. Miller's Field was on the edge of town, a wide, grassy expanse that seemed to exist solely for events like the fair. Most of the year, it sat empty, the grass growing wild and the fences leaning at odd angles, but when the fair came, it transformed. Trucks rolled in, their beds piled high with tents and machinery, and within days, the field was alive with color and movement. By the time Friday evening arrived, the fairground was unrecognizable, its dirt paths lined with lights that blinked and sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars. We arrived as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with shades of pink and gold. The air was thick with the smells of popcorn and fried dough, mingling with the faint metallic tang of machinery. Music drifted through the warm evening, a jumble of merry-go-round tunes and the excited shouts of the crowd. It felt like stepping into another world, one where the ordinary rules of Sycamore Street didn't apply. The first thing I noticed was the Ferris wheel, its lights blazing against the darkening sky. It towered above the fairground, its steel frame gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. I had never been on it before, the height alone was enough to make my stomach flip, but something about it called to me, a quiet challenge I wasn't quite ready to face. Instead, we made our way to the games. They were lined up in neat rows, their booths draped with striped awnings, their attendants calling out to the passing crowd with promises of prizes. There were rings to toss, bottles to knock over, and darts to throw, each game deceptively simple. Jimmy was the first to try his luck, stepping up to a booth where the goal was to toss a ring onto the neck of a milk bottle. The attendant handed him 3 rings, their plastic edges smooth and slick, and Jimmy lined up his shot with a look of determination. The first ring bounced off the bottle's neck with a hollow clink, and the second sailed wide, landing in the sawdust beyond. The third spun in the air, wobbling slightly before it clattered against the glass and fell to the ground. The attendant grinned and handed Jimmy a small consolation prize, a plastic whistle shaped like a duck, before turning to the next eager player. Toad had better luck at the dart game, where the goal was to pop balloons pinned to a corkboard. His first dart hit its mark with a satisfying pop, and his second landed just shy of another balloon. The attendant handed him a prize, a tiny stuffed bear with one crooked ear, and Toad held it aloft like a trophy, his grin wide and triumphant. The carousel was next, its painted horses bobbing up and down to the cheerful strains of organ music. The line wasn't long, and soon we were choosing our mounts. Jimmy picked a black stallion with a mane of gold, while Susie climbed onto a white mare with a garland of roses around its neck. I chose a bright red horse with a gleaming saddle, its head tilted back as though it were frozen mid-gallop. The ride began with a lurch, the music swelling as we spun in lazy circles, the world blurring into streaks of light and color. By the time we stepped off the carousel, the sky had darkened completely, and the fairground was aglow with lights. The Ferris wheel loomed above us, its cabin swinging gently as it turned against the night sky. I felt the familiar flutter of nerves in my stomach as I stared up at it, its height even more imposing now that the sun was gone. Jimmy noticed my hesitation and nudged me with his elbow, his grin mischievous. I shook my head at first, but he was relentless, and before I knew it, we were climbing into one of the wheel's small, swaying cabins. The attendant pulled the safety bar into place, and the wheel began to move, its gears groaning softly as it lifted us higher and higher. The view from the top was unlike anything I had ever seen. The fairground spread out below us, its lights twinkling like a field of fireflies, its paths filled with the shifting shapes of the crowd. Beyond the edge of the field, the town lay quiet and dark, the faint glow of streetlights marking the edges of Sycamore Street. For a moment, the height didn't matter, the world felt vast and beautiful, and I felt small in the best possible way. When the ride ended, we stumbled out of the cabin, our legs shaky but our spirits high. The fair felt different now, its magic amplified by the view from above. We wandered through the stalls, stopping to buy sticks of cotton candy that melted on our tongues and left our fingers sticky with sugar. The air buzzed with energy, the sounds of the crowd blending with the music and the hum of the rides. As the evening wore on, the fairground began to quiet, the crowd thinning as families made their way home. We stayed until the very end, watching the fireworks explode over Miller's Field in bursts of red and gold. The sky lit up with each dazzling display, the sound of the explosions echoing through the night like distant thunder. It was the kind of beauty that made you hold your breath, afraid to blink and miss even a second. When the fireworks ended, we made our way back to Sycamore Street, the cool night air wrapping around us like a blanket. The glow of the fair lingered in my mind, its lights and sound still vivid as we parted ways beneath the sycamore tree. As I climbed into bed that night, my ears still ringing faintly from the noise, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The fair had been everything I had hoped for and more, a perfect slice of summer magic. Outside my window, the stars blinked faintly in the vastness of the night sky, and I wondered how many summers they had watched over. The fair would be gone by morning, packed away into trucks that would carry it to the next town, but its memory would stay with me, a bright and fleeting joy etched into the fabric of my childhood. Every kid in the neighborhood knew about the old treehouse that stood in the woods behind Sycamore Street. It wasn't much to look at anymore, a sagging platform nailed to the thick branches of an ancient oak, its boards gray and splintered with age. It had been built years before any of us were old enough to climb its rickety ladder, by older kids whose names had faded into legend. By the time we came along, it was little more than a relic, a shadow of the fortress it had once been. That summer, though, we decided it was time to bring it back to life. The idea started with Jimmy, who always had a knack for seeing potential where others saw ruin. He showed up at the sycamore tree one morning, armed with a hammer that looked far too big for him and a stack of boards he'd scrounged from his dad's shed. His grin was wide and infectious, and before long, we were all caught up in his enthusiasm. Rebuilding the treehouse became our mission, our purpose, the kind of grand project that could fill the endless days of summer with meaning. The first step was getting to the treehouse itself, which was easier said than done. The ladder that had once led up to it was long gone, its wooden rungs rotted away and its rope frayed and dangling. Toad was the first to try climbing the tree without it, scrambling up the trunk with a determination that almost made up for his lack of coordination. He made it about halfway before losing his grip and sliding back to the ground, his hands covered in dirt and his pride bruised but intact. It was Susie who came up with the solution, her sharp mind always quick to find a way forward. She rigged a makeshift pulley system using an old rope and a bucket, which we used to hoist tools and supplies up to the platform. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, and before long, we were standing on the weathered boards of the treehouse, surveying our new kingdom. The platform was solid enough, though the boards creaked ominously under our weight, and the walls, such as they were little more than scraps of plywood nailed haphazardly to the branches. The roof was a patchwork of shingles and tar paper, with gaping holes that let the sunlight stream through in jagged beams. It was perfect. We set to work with the kind of energy only kids can muster, our small hands wielding hammers and saws with more enthusiasm than skill. Jimmy took charge, directing us with a confidence that made up for his lack of experience, while Susie kept us focused, her sharp eye catching every wobbly nail and uneven board. Toad was in charge of gathering supplies, a job that suited him perfectly, as it gave him an excuse to rummage through sheds and alleys in search of hidden treasures. The work was slow and messy, but it was ours, and that made all the difference. Each board we nailed into place, each rope we tied to the branches, each scrap of fabric we draped across the roof, it all felt like a triumph, a victory over the passage of time and the pull of gravity. The treehouse came alive beneath our hands, its walls straightening, its platform strengthening, its roof taking shape with every hour we spent on it. By the end of the first week, it no longer felt like a relic. It was a fortress, a haven, a place where the rules of the world couldn't reach us. We added a ladder, sturdy and straight, carved from the trunk of a fallen tree we'd found in the woods. We built a trapdoor in the floor, complete with a pulley system to lift it, and hung an old tire swing from one of the lower branches, its rope creaking softly in the breeze. The crowning achievement, though, was the flag. Susie stitched it together from scraps of fabric we'd collected, its patchwork design a riot of color and shapes. We raised it to the highest branch we could reach, watching as it caught the wind and fluttered above the treetops like a beacon. It wasn't just a treehouse anymore, it was ours, a kingdom in the sky, a monument to the endless possibilities of summer. The treehouse became our headquarters, the center of our world. We spent entire days there, sprawled across the platform as the sunlight filtered through the leaves, our voices mingling with the rustling of the trees and the chirping of birds. We played games that stretched across its walls and beyond, battles and quests and daring escapes that left us breathless with laughter. We held meetings there, plotting our next adventures with the seriousness of generals planning a campaign. Sometimes, we didn't need games or plans. Sometimes, it was enough to simply sit and listen to the woods around us, the sounds of the creek in the distance and the wind in the trees. The treehouse had a way of making the world feel smaller and larger at the same time, its branches stretching out like arms to hold us close, while its height gave us a view that seemed to stretch forever. One afternoon, as we sat in the treehouse, Toad pointed to a patch of woods in the distance, where the trees grew darker and closer together. He claimed he'd seen something moving there, a shadow darting between the trunks, too large to be a deer but too quick to be a person. The suggestion sent a shiver of excitement through us, and we spent the rest of the day watching the woods, imagining what might be hiding there. The treehouse became the base for those explorations and more. It was a launch pad for our adventures, a retreat when the world felt too big, a place where time slowed down and the days stretched endlessly. It was ours in a way that nothing else ever had been, a place that felt like home even though it was built from scraps and nails and the sheer force of our imaginations. As summer wore on, the treehouse began to take on a life of its own. The branches grew around its edges, wrapping it in a natural embrace, and the leaves formed a canopy so thick that it felt like a secret world hidden high above the ground. The flag faded in the sun, its colors softening into muted shades, but it still flew proudly, a reminder of what we had built together. Looking back, I realize now that the treehouse was more than just a place. It was a moment in time, a symbol of everything that summer meant to us. It was the freedom to create, to explore, to dream without limits. It was the bond we shared, the laughter and the arguments, the triumphs and the mistakes. It was a piece of our childhood, carved into the branches of an ancient oak, a memory that would stay with us long after the summer had ended. The trouble began with a perfect hit. The kind of hit that sends the ball soaring into the air, where it hangs for a moment as if defying gravity, before plummeting back to earth in a graceful arc. It was the kind of hit every kid dreams of, the crack of the bat reverberating in your ears as you watched the ball streak across the sky. It was Jimmy who made the hit, and for a moment, we all froze, craning our necks to follow its path. The ball sailed over the rusted chain-link fence at the edge of the vacant lot we used as a makeshift baseball field. It disappeared into the dense thicket of trees and undergrowth that marked the beginning of Old Man Garver's yard, a place we had spent most of our lives avoiding. Even from a distance, the yard seemed alive, its shadows shifting and stretching like something waiting to pounce. The house beyond was no better, its weathered boards and sagging roof giving it the air of a beast in a long, uneasy slumber. For years, stories had swirled around Old Man Garver's place, whispered tales passed between kids with the solemnity of legend. Some said he had once been a scientist who blew up his lab, leaving his face horribly scarred. Others claimed he had a pet wolf that prowled the yard at night, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. A few insisted they'd seen him wandering the streets late at night, muttering to himself in a language no one could understand. None of us had ever seen him up close. The most anyone ever managed was a glimpse through the dusty windows of his house, a shadowy figure moving slowly through the rooms, his shape distorted by the warped glass. The stories were enough to keep us away, and the ball's landing in his yard was a moment of shared horror. For a while, we just stood there, the bat dangling loosely in Jimmy's hand, the weight of what had happened sinking in. The baseball was our only one, a scuffed and battered relic held together with fraying stitching, but it was ours. It had survived countless games, scraped against gravel and splintered bats, and to lose it now felt unthinkable. We huddled together at the edge of the lot, our voices low as we debated what to do. Jimmy, being Jimmy, was all for charging in and getting the ball. Toad, whose imagination always leaned toward the dramatic, painted vivid pictures of traps and dangers waiting just beyond the fence. Susie, the most level-headed among us, pointed out that it was just a ball, but even she couldn't hide the flicker of unease in her eyes. Eventually, we decided we couldn't leave the ball behind. It wasn't just about the game, it was about what the ball represented, a piece of our summer, our friendship, our world. Leaving it felt like leaving a part of ourselves, and so, with more than a little trepidation, we made our way to the fence. The fence groaned under our weight as we climbed it, its rusted links digging into our hands. On the other side, the air felt different, heavier, cooler, as though we had crossed some invisible threshold into a place where time moved slower. The ground was uneven, covered in a tangle of weeds and ivy that tugged at our ankles as we pushed through. The trees here were taller, their branches casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach for us as we passed. The ball wasn't far, caught in a patch of undergrowth near the base of a tree. It gleamed faintly in the dappled light, its scuffed surface a comforting reminder of the world we had left behind. Jimmy made a beeline for it, his steps quick and sure, but before he could reach it, something moved. It was just a flicker at first, a shadow shifting among the trees, but it stopped us in our tracks. The air seemed to still, the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds falling silent as we strained to see what it was. The shape was indistinct, low and hunched, moving slowly through the undergrowth. It could have been a dog, or maybe a raccoon, but something about it felt wrong. Jimmy froze, his hand hovering over the ball, his eyes wide and fixed on the shadow. For a moment, none of us moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to touch. Then, with a suddenness that made my heart leap, the shadow darted deeper into the yard, disappearing into the thick growth near the house. Jimmy grabbed the ball and scrambled back to us, his face pale but triumphant. He held it up like a trophy, his grin shaky but proud, and we wasted no time making our way back to the fence. The climb back over felt longer, the weight of the moment pressing down on us as we scrambled to the other side. When we finally stood on the familiar dirt of the vacant lot, the relief was palpable. We didn't talk about the shadow, not at first. It felt too strange, too out of place, like something that belonged to a different world. Instead, we brushed the dirt off the ball and tried to pick up the game where we had left off, but the energy was gone. The shadow lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet, insistent presence that refused to fade. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Old Man Garver's yard. The shadow, the stillness, the air that felt so different, it all seemed connected, part of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. The ball sat on my desk, its surface scuffed and worn, but it felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. I thought about the stories we had told, the rumors and legends that had kept us away from the yard for so long. They had always felt like just that, stories, inventions of restless minds and vivid imaginations. But now, for the first time, I wondered if there was something more to them, something real hiding beneath the layers of exaggeration and fear. The summer stretched on, the days growing hotter and the nights quieter, but the memory of that afternoon stayed with me. It wasn't just the shadow, or the yard, or the feeling of being watched. It was the sense that we had crossed into a place we weren't meant to go, a place that would linger in our minds long after the summer ended. Outside my window, the fireflies blinked in the dark, their tiny lights weaving patterns in the night. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, its voice sharp and lonely against the stillness. I closed my eyes, the sound of the shadow's movement rustling faintly in my mind, and drifted into dreams filled with trees and whispers and the soft, steady rhythm of a ball rolling through the dark. The air felt heavy that morning, thick and oppressive, as though the sky itself was pressing down on Sycamore Street. Even the birds seemed quieter, their usual chatter replaced by an occasional faint call that hung uneasily in the stillness. The neighborhood, usually alive with the sounds of kids playing, sprinklers hissing, and lawnmowers humming, had fallen into a strange silence. I stepped outside and looked up. The sky was a strange, pale gray, streaked with darker clouds that seemed to twist and stretch in unnatural patterns. The sun was hidden, its warmth dulled by the dense atmosphere. It was the kind of day where you could feel the storm coming, the electricity buzzing faintly in the air and tickling the fine hairs on your arms. Jimmy was waiting under the sycamore tree, a stick in his hands that he twirled absently as he watched the sky. Toad and Susie arrived soon after, their bikes rolling to a stop in the gravel near the curb. We exchanged a few words about the weather, the unease clear in our voices, but none of us were ready to go inside just yet. The storm hadn't arrived, and until it did, the day was still ours. We decided to head to the treehouse, the woods offering a kind of solace that Sycamore Street couldn't. The leaves rustled faintly as we walked, their movement too slight to explain the eerie whispers that seemed to drift through the air. The path felt narrower, the trees closer, their branches casting long shadows that danced with the shifting light. By the time we reached the treehouse, the wind had picked up, tugging at the flag we had hung from its highest branch. It flapped wildly, its colors muted against the darkening sky. The air smelled of rain, sharp and metallic, mingled with the earthy scent of damp wood and moss. We climbed up quickly, the platform swaying slightly beneath our weight as the wind pushed at the branches. From the height of the treehouse, we could see the storm gathering in the distance. The clouds rolled and churned, their edges tinged with green and purple, a kaleidoscope of motion and light. Lightning flashed occasionally, a quick, jagged streak that lit up the horizon for a split second before fading into the gloom. We sat in silence for a while, watching the storm approach. The woods below us seemed to shift with every gust of wind, the trees bending and swaying as though caught in some ancient dance. The stillness of the morning had given way to a rising energy, a tension that vibrated through the air and settled deep in my chest. Jimmy broke the silence first, his voice quiet and thoughtful. He said something about the storm feeling alive, like it was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Normally, we would have laughed at such an idea, dismissing it as one of Jimmy's wild imaginings, but today, it didn't feel so far-fetched. Toad suggested we go back to Sycamore Street, his nervousness barely concealed beneath his usual bravado. Susie, ever the pragmatist, pointed out that the storm was moving faster than we could, and we were better off waiting it out in the treehouse. Her words were steady, but I could see the tension in her hands as she gripped the edge of the platform. And so, we waited. The storm hit with a force that took my breath away. The first raindrops were heavy and cold, slapping against the wooden boards of the treehouse with a sound like distant drums. The wind howled through the trees, whipping the branches back and forth and sending leaves spiraling into the air. Lightning flashed closer now, the thunder that followed shaking the very ground beneath us. The rain came harder, sheets of water cascading through the canopy and soaking us to the bone. The treehouse groaned and creaked with each gust of wind, its timbers holding firm but protesting loudly. We huddled together on the platform, our backs pressed against the rough walls, our voices drowned out by the roar of the storm. For a moment it felt as though the world had shrunk to the size of the treehouse, everything beyond its swaying walls swallowed by the chaos of the storm. The woods were a blur of motion and sound, the rain so thick that it seemed to erase the boundaries between the trees, the ground, and the sky. The air buzzed with static, each flash of lightning sending waves of energy coursing through the space around us. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to ease. The wind slowed, its howling replaced by a low, steady hum. The rain softened, its drumming fading to a gentle patter. The lightning grew fainter, the flashes less frequent, their light no longer illuminating the entire sky. The world outside the treehouse came back into focus, the woods emerging from the haze like a painting drying after a wash of water. We stepped onto the platform, the boards slick beneath our feet, and looked out at the aftermath of the storm. The ground below was littered with fallen branches and scattered leaves, the creek swollen and rushing with new vigor. The flag that had flown proudly above the treehouse was gone, its tattered remnants tangled in the branches below. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. As we made our way back to Sycamore Street, the air felt fresher, lighter, as though the storm had washed away more than just the dirt and debris. The sun broke through the clouds in patches, its golden light spilling across the wet pavement and glinting off the puddles that dotted the ground. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes after a shared moment of awe. The grown-ups were out in their yards, inspecting the damage and chatting in low voices, their faces a mix of relief and weariness. The kids were already back at play, their shouts and laughter cutting through the lingering silence like birdsong after a long winter. Under the sycamore tree, we stood for a moment, our clothes damp and our faces streaked with dirt. The storm had been wild and terrifying, but it had also been exhilarating, a reminder of the power and beauty of the world beyond our control. It had shaken us, yes, but it had also left us stronger, our bonds forged anew in the crucible of thunder and rain. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the storm played over and over in my mind. The flashes of lightning, the roar of the wind, the way the treehouse had held firm even as the world around it seemed to unravel. It felt like a metaphor for something I couldn't quite put into words, a lesson hidden in the chaos. Outside, the night was still and quiet, the stars shining faintly through the last wisps of cloud. The storm was gone, but its energy lingered, a hum in the back of my mind, a reminder that even in the wildest moments, there is beauty to be found. The morning after the storm, Sycamore Street woke slowly, the air fresh and cool, the kind of crispness that only follows a summer tempest. The world looked cleaner, sharper, as though the rain had polished every surface to a bright shine. The sycamore leaves glistened with droplets that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight, and the streets were dotted with puddles that reflected the sky in patches of deep blue. The storm had left its mark. Branches littered the yards, some larger than seemed possible, as though the wind had reached into the earth and ripped pieces of the world apart. Down at the creek, the water surged higher than we'd ever seen, its edges swollen and muddy, carrying leaves and bits of debris downstream in a rush of energy. It was there, near the creek's edge, that we found the first clue. The four of us had gone out early, eager to explore the woods in the storm's aftermath. The path leading to the treehouse was littered with leaves and twigs, and we had to navigate carefully to avoid slipping in the damp mud. The air smelled rich and earthy, the kind of scent that seemed to sink deep into your lungs and settle there. Jimmy spotted it first, a cluster of stones at the edge of the creek, half buried in the soft, rain-soaked earth. At first, they looked like any other stones, smooth and gray, their surfaces glinting faintly in the sunlight. But as we moved closer, we saw the difference. They weren't arranged naturally. They formed a circle, their edges aligned with a precision that nature couldn't explain. Toad knelt beside them, his fingers brushing away the mud and revealing a faint pattern etched into their surfaces. The lines were worn and faint, but their shapes were unmistakable, spirals, crosses, and other symbols that seemed strangely familiar. They reminded me of something, though I couldn't place what. Perhaps the patterns on the box we'd found in the woods, or the symbols in the book that had sparked so many questions earlier that summer. Susie was the first to notice the path. It wasn't a path in the traditional sense, there was no trail of flattened grass or packed dirt, but it was there, marked by subtle changes in the trees and the undergrowth. The trees in this part of the woods were older, their trunks thicker and their roots more twisted, but here, they seemed to part slightly, their branches forming a natural arch that led deeper into the forest. The ground was dotted with more stones, each one bearing faint etchings, like breadcrumbs leading us forward. None of us spoke as we followed the path. The air grew cooler the farther we went, the sunlight dimming as the canopy thickened overhead. The trees seemed to lean closer together, their branches forming shadows that danced across the ground with every whisper of wind. The sounds of the creek faded behind us, replaced by a stillness that felt both serene and heavy, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. The path ended in a clearing, smaller and darker than the one where we had built the treehouse. At its center stood a stone pillar, weathered and moss-covered, its surface etched with the same intricate symbols we had seen on the stones by the creek. The pillar was about as tall as Jimmy, its top flat and smooth, as though it had been designed to hold something. Around its base, the ground was clear of debris, the grass thin and patchy, as though the storm's wind and rain had been deflected by some unseen force. We circled the pillar cautiously, our movements slow and deliberate. There was something about it that demanded reverence, a quiet insistence that we not disturb whatever it was guarding. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to glow faintly in the dappled light, their lines shifting ever so slightly, as though they were alive. It was Susie who noticed the small, circular depression in the pillar's top. It was perfectly round, its edges smooth and precise, and it reminded me immediately of the sphere we had found in the spiraling column back in the hidden chamber. The similarity sent a shiver through me, a quiet thrill that tugged at the edges of my thoughts. Jimmy reached out to touch the pillar, his fingers brushing lightly against the moss-covered stone. The moment he did, the air seemed to change. The faint hum we had felt before, at the treehouse, at the creek, at Old Man Garver's yard, returned, stronger now, vibrating through the clearing with a resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. Toad stepped back, his eyes wide, and Susie moved closer, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. I felt the pull again, that same quiet insistence I had felt when we found the box, when I first touched the glowing sphere. It was as though the pillar, the path, the symbols, they had been waiting for us. We spent hours in the clearing, examining the pillar and the stones around it, tracing the symbols with our fingers and trying to piece together their meaning. The hum never faded, its rhythm steady and constant, a reminder that the clearing was more than just a place. It was a connection, a thread that tied us to something larger, something older than the woods, older than Sycamore Street itself. As the afternoon light began to fade, we reluctantly made our way back to the creek, our minds buzzing with questions. The path seemed different on the way out, its twists and turns less distinct, as though the woods were shifting around us. When we reached the creek, the circle of stones was still there, their etched surfaces gleaming faintly in the golden light of evening. We didn't talk much on the way home. The weight of what we had found hung over us, a quiet, shared understanding that we had stumbled onto something that was both extraordinary and unsettling. The pillar, the symbols, the path, they were pieces of a puzzle that we didn't yet know how to solve, but their presence had changed something in us, something that couldn't be undone. That night, as I lay in bed, the images of the pillar and the path played over and over in my mind. The hum lingered in my thoughts, a faint vibration that seemed to echo the rhythm of my heartbeat. The storm had cleared the air, but it had also uncovered something that had been hidden just beneath the surface of our world. Outside my window, the fireflies blinked faintly in the darkness, their light steady and rhythmic, like a code waiting to be deciphered. I closed my eyes, the memory of the clearing and its strange, glowing symbols etched into my thoughts, and drifted into dreams filled with spirals and stones and a path that stretched endlessly into the unknown. The day after we found the pillar, the world felt different. Sycamore Street was still the same, its sycamore trees casting dappled shadows on cracked sidewalks, the smell of fresh-cut grass mingling with the distant hum of lawnmowers, but there was a quiet tension in the air, a sense that something just beneath the surface was waiting to be uncovered. The four of us felt it too, though none of us said it outright. It was there in the way Jimmy tapped his foot against the curb, in the way Toad fidgeted with the zipper of his jacket, and in the faraway look in Susie's eyes as she stared toward the woods. The pillar had left its mark on us. The symbols etched into its surface, the hum that seemed to resonate through the very air, the path that had appeared so suddenly and ended so deliberately, it all pointed to something bigger, something we didn't yet understand. And then there was the circular depression at the top of the pillar, its shape so perfectly matching the sphere we had seen earlier that summer. The connection was impossible to ignore. We decided to return to the clearing, this time armed with notebooks, flashlights, and a quiet determination to uncover its secrets. The storm had cleared most of the debris from the woods, leaving the path easier to follow. The air was cooler, the sunlight softer, and the sounds of the creek and the occasional bird gave the woods a sense of calm that belied the unease simmering beneath the surface. When we reached the clearing, the pillar was just as we had left it, its moss-covered surface bathed in golden light. The symbols etched into its stone seemed sharper in the daylight, their lines more deliberate, as though they had shifted overnight. The faint hum returned as we stepped closer, vibrating through the soles of my sneakers and into my chest. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, a rhythm that matched the thrum of my own heartbeat. Susie was the one who spotted it. She had wandered a few steps beyond the clearing's edge, her sharp eyes scanning the ground for anything out of place. At first, it seemed like just another patch of disturbed earth, its surface uneven and littered with broken twigs and leaves. But as she brushed the dirt away, a shape began to emerge, a rectangle, its edges faintly defined beneath the layer of soil. We all crowded around as Susie worked, her hands quick and methodical, the dirt falling away to reveal the edges of a wooden box. It was small, no larger than a shoebox, its surface worn smooth by time. The wood was dark and damp, its corners reinforced with tarnished metal brackets that had grown faintly green with age. It looked old, older than the treehouse, older than the clearing, older than us. Jimmy reached for it first, his fingers brushing against the wood as though afraid it might crumble beneath his touch. The box was heavier than it looked, its weight solid and comforting as he lifted it free from the dirt. The metal latch on the front was rusted shut, but Susie quickly produced a screwdriver from her backpack and pried it open with a satisfying pop. Inside was a collection of objects, each one carefully arranged and seemingly untouched by time. There was a smooth, round stone, its surface etched with the same swirling patterns as the pillar. A piece of paper, its edges yellowed and fragile, bore a series of hand-drawn symbols that matched those on the stones we had found near the creek. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, was a key. The key was unlike any I'd ever seen. It was made of metal, its surface dark and cool, with intricate carvings along the shaft and a head shaped like the crescent mark we had come to recognize. It hummed faintly as I held it, a vibration so subtle that I wasn't sure if it was real or simply my imagination. It felt important, significant, as though it held the answer to a question we hadn't yet asked. We spent hours examining the contents of the box, each piece a new thread in the tapestry of the mystery we were unraveling. The stone, with its etched patterns, seemed to resonate with the symbols on the pillar, its lines glowing faintly in the dim light of the clearing. The paper, though faded and delicate, appeared to be a map, its lines and shapes forming a network of paths and landmarks that mirrored the woods around us. The key, however, held our attention most. Its weight, its carvings, its faint hum, it all pointed to something larger, something waiting to be unlocked. We debated its purpose, tossing ideas back and forth as the sunlight began to fade and the shadows grew longer. Toad suggested it might open a hidden door in the pillar, while Jimmy speculated that it was part of a larger mechanism, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Susie, ever pragmatic, pointed out that we didn't even know if it belonged to the clearing at all, it could just as easily be connected to the treehouse, or the creek, or the yard where we had found the ball. As the day turned to evening, we reluctantly packed up the box and its contents, carefully wrapping the key in the cloth and tucking it safely into Susie's backpack. The clearing seemed to hum softly as we left, its energy quieter now, as though it were watching us go. The path back to Sycamore Street felt shorter this time, the woods less imposing, the air lighter. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the key lingered in my mind. Its weight, its hum, the way it seemed to vibrate with a life of its own, it all pointed to something bigger, something waiting just beyond the edges of what we could see. The box, the map, the pillar, they were pieces of a puzzle we were only beginning to understand. Outside my window, the fireflies blinked faintly in the darkness, their light steady and rhythmic, like a code waiting to be cracked. Somewhere in the distance, the creek murmured softly, its voice a reminder of the hidden currents that ran beneath the surface of our world. I closed my eyes, the image of the key etched into my thoughts, and drifted into dreams filled with spirals, symbols, and a door waiting to be opened. The final days of summer always seemed to carry a certain weight, a quiet sense of something ending. The air felt different, cooler in the mornings and heavier in the evenings, as though the season itself was growing tired. The sycamore leaves, so vibrant and green at the start of summer, had begun to turn faintly at the edges, their tips tinged with yellow. The fireflies still blinked in the twilight, but their numbers were dwindling, their light softer, more hesitant, as though they too could feel the change coming. We gathered under the sycamore tree one last time, the box from the clearing resting on the grass between us. Its contents, map, stone, key, had been examined so many times that we knew them by heart, yet we pored over them again, as though we might uncover something new in their familiar lines and shapes. The key still hummed faintly when we held it, its vibration a quiet reminder of the unanswered questions that had defined our summer. The map was what finally drew us back to the clearing. Its lines and symbols, so faint and delicate, seemed to shimmer in the fading light, leading us to one spot in particular, a place we hadn't noticed before, tucked away in a corner of the woods beyond the pillar. It wasn't far, according to the map, but it felt like the edge of the world, a place that existed just beyond the boundaries of what we knew. The path to the clearing was quieter this time, the woods subdued in the late summer light. The air smelled of dry leaves and damp earth, and the faint sound of the creek in the distance seemed softer, more restrained. We followed the map carefully, its lines guiding us past the pillar and deeper into the woods than we had ever gone before. The spot marked on the map was unremarkable at first glance, a small patch of ground bordered by thick trees and tangled undergrowth. But as we stepped closer, we saw the difference. The earth here was darker, richer, and the grass grew in neat, circular patterns, as though shaped by an unseen hand. At the center of it all was another stone structure, smaller than the pillar but no less deliberate. It was a pedestal, its top smooth and flat, with a shallow depression at its center that perfectly matched the shape of the key. Jimmy stepped forward, the key clutched tightly in his hand. None of us spoke as he placed it into the depression, its carved edges sliding into place with a soft click. For a moment, nothing happened. The woods were still, the air heavy with anticipation, and then the pedestal began to hum. The sound was faint at first, a low vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The key began to glow, its surface shimmering with the same soft light as the symbols on the map and the pillar. The hum grew louder, its rhythm steady and resonant, and the pedestal began to move. Its top twisted slowly, the stone grinding softly against itself as the key turned within its slot. The ground beneath us vibrated faintly, the air around us charged with an energy that made my skin tingle. As the pedestal completed its rotation, a beam of light shot upward from its center, piercing the canopy and disappearing into the sky. The light was warm and golden, its glow filling the clearing with a soft brilliance that seemed to banish every shadow. The map in Susie's hands shimmered faintly, its lines glowing in response, as though the two were connected by some invisible thread. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the light faded. The hum quieted, the pedestal stilled, and the key's glow dimmed to a faint shimmer before vanishing entirely. The clearing fell silent once more, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. We stood there for a long moment, the air around us thick with the weight of what had just happened. There were no answers, no revelations, just the quiet certainty that we had unlocked something we couldn't fully understand, but that felt significant nonetheless. The key had done its part, and now it rested quietly in the pedestal, its surface dark and cool once more. As we made our way back to Sycamore Street, the woods seemed different, though I couldn't say why. The trees felt taller, the shadows deeper, the air heavier with the scent of summer's end. The creek murmured softly as we passed, its voice carrying a note of finality that made my chest ache with something I couldn't quite name. That evening, the fireflies returned in force, their lights blinking and swirling in the warm night air. We chased them through the yards and across the street, our laughter ringing out like a song. It felt like the last act of summer, a final burst of light before the season slipped away into memory. As the night deepened, we gathered under the sycamore tree, our breaths coming in soft, uneven bursts. The fireflies hovered around us, their light steady and rhythmic, as though bidding us farewell. We sat in silence, the weight of the summer settling over us like a blanket, warm and comforting and impossibly heavy. The key, the map, the pillar, they were mysteries we might never fully understand, but they had become a part of us, woven into the fabric of our lives. They had made our summer unforgettable, a season of discovery and wonder that would linger in our minds long after the fireflies were gone. As I lay in bed that night, the sounds of the woods and the creek fading into the distance, I felt a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. The summer was ending, yes, but it had given us something extraordinary, moments of light and laughter, of mystery and magic, of connection and belonging. It was a summer that would live on, not just in our memories, but in the way it had shaped us, in the threads it had woven into the story of who we were becoming. Outside my window, the last firefly blinked softly in the darkness, its light steady and sure, a quiet reminder that even the briefest moments can leave a lasting glow.